Should I go ahead?
Go ahead.
All right, perfect. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our first UofT Robotics Institute seminar in 2023. We are looking forward to today's talk by a very exciting speaker, Professor Hannah Stuart, who's joining us virtually from UC Berkeley. Professor Stuart is an assistant professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at Berkeley with a Don Cunningham endowed professorship. She received her undergraduate degree in mechanical engineering at George Washington University in 2011, and her master's and PhD in mechanical engineering at Stanford in 2013 and 2018, respectively, supervised by Mark Katkowski. Her research focuses on understanding the mechanics of physical interaction in order to better design systems for dexterous manipulation. A major focus is real-world field deployment of robots, including the design of bio-inspired systems for remote exploration in challenging environments like in the ocean or on the surface of the moon. For those of you who have seen the Oceanone robot from Stanford, you will soon realize that Hannah was behind most of that work for manipulation. Her work has been recognized with multiple research awards, including the NASA Early Career Faculty Grant and Johnson & Johnson Women in STEM 2D Grant, as well as Best Paper Awards. She's also a current co-chair of the IEEE Technical Committee on Mechanisms and Design and the Technical Committee on Robotic Hands, Grasping and Manipulation, as well as an associate editor for IEEE Robotics and Automation Letters. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Hannah.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and I'm honored to be your first of 2023 first speaker. And so, you know, like you just heard, my real interest is on how we design systems. So I'm really coming from this mechanical perspective, not necessarily with a central focus on controls, but on the mechanisms itself and really the physics of interaction. And when I say messy, you know, I think you can think of this in many different ways. I think it could be physically messy. So you could think of this sink of dirty dishes. It might have goop or honey or something kind of sticky, as well as, you know, granular media or the ocean. But then it also is kind of a messy problem, because how do you simulate these really complex physical interactions in a way that's going to be useful for robotic systems? So I want you to think of messy in both of those ways today. Okay, and so let's go ahead and dive right into the presentation. So before I actually go into everything, I wanted to just acknowledge the incredible and talented group of researchers that I get to work with. And you're going to see work represented by a number of folks. I try to put their photo in the top right-hand corner when I'm presenting someone's work, so go ahead and keep an eye there. And then to acknowledge the funding sources that make this work possible. Today, you're going to primarily hear about work funded by NASA, by NSF, and by the Department of Defense. Okay, so I run the Embodied Dexterity Group, EDGE for short, and we think about robotic systems. And so a robot needs to have intelligence, yes, and so this could be something like sensors and computation, but it also needs a body. We need embodiment. And so these are two sides of this robotics coin. And then we think about these systems in contact. Now, as you heard, I did my training with Professor Mark Katkowski, and this is one of my favorite quotes that just really encapsulates the importance of this intersection. Like the performance of a sports car, which is ultimately limited by the tires on its wheels, the performance of a robotic hand is limited by the skin on its fingers. And so this is just really such an important element. And as you can see here, my expertise is in the design and understanding of robotic hands. And so here we're going to add a little bit more resolution in this space. So when I'm thinking about designing and prototyping systems for field deployment, a lot of times there's a real utility in adding compliant elements, maybe under actuation. And so that's going to also be a common theme that comes up. Well, one element of the design of compliant hands is the compliance itself, or the kinematics of how it's going to interact with objects. And on the left-hand side, you're going to see two identical hands, except that the compliance of the different joints is mixed up. And this is a really mature field of studying how we design these compliant and under-actuated systems to get different motion behaviors and different forces as we interact with different objects. Now, that's a relatively rich field already. And so as I move forward, I'm actually much more interested in the right-hand side, which is how our contact conditions are going to influence our behavior. So here in this toy problem, we have identical hands, but this time we have different friction coefficients with that object. And so very small changes in contact conditions. Nothing here is a geometric change, right? It's purely frictional, and this can make the difference between success and failure. So that really motivates the basis of our work. Now, I like to think this not only as a challenge, but a great opportunity. And so a lot of times what we're trying to do in the lab is to flip this around and say, hey, if we have mechanisms that change our contact conditions just a little bit, we could have a really big impact on our overall behavior. And so I see this as a cool design challenge as well. Okay, so I'm only going to be able to focus on a small subset of work, and here's a diagram showing the different applications that we're working on. I'm going to start here, which is my thesis work on the design of the hands for Oceanone, the deep sea diving robot, and then that's going to motivate us to think about what does contact condition look like when we're underwater. Right, so it could be lubrication, or it could be how do we actually manipulate our contact condition with suction. And then we're going to start thinking about how we might harness these ideas to now sense our contact conditions through tactile sensors, still using ideas of flow and suction. And then we're going to take a break from underwater environments because not everybody works on underwater robots, and think about sort of terrains in air, and so granular media and other terrains on land. Okay, so starting out, here is Oceanone, and it's coming down at the ocean, where we actually got to take this to the Mediterranean. Now, this is a really large team of researchers who was working on this, and this was done at Stanford University, directed by Professor Oceanone. And my job was to build those hands. So the part after the orange, at the very end, that's the part that I designed and built. And the really cool thing about this is we were able to go to the Mediterranean and actually go down to a shipwreck and test this on a more realistic sort of archaeological application. And here you can see they're teleoperating it. And we were able to actually grab a vase. And this was a shipwreck from 1664, I believe. And so it had been a very long time since it had been touched. And a lot of the work for this was to essentially ensure that the hands would not fail during operation. So I remember early on in the project, Osama said, you know, you're building the hands. If the hands break, we can't grab anything. We're going to be very limited in the manipulation that we can do. And so the resilience is really critical. And so that became a central theme in my thesis. And I focused a lot of effort on thinking about the compliant elements in this hand, how we could create a very simple gripper, a one actuator gripper that could do a variety of different behaviors. And so I'm not going to spend much time on this because I want to get to the contact conditions. But the main punchline here is that, you know, we can essentially change the different compliant elements, and that's what the red, pink, and the blue, pink, and green are showing you. And there's different benefits to this. And you essentially want to be able to dramatically change the stiffness of your device using sort of clever spring mechanisms that are loaded in different ways. Now, if you're interested in the compliance and contact and kinematics of this, please check out the paper. And we have actually published an open source version of this hand design. And I highly recommend, if you're interested in prototyping it, it's actually pretty easy to make and relatively inexpensive for a robot hand. Okay, but you know, resilience and waterproofing is not the only impact of being underwater. So even the robot arms that we used were based on a design for operation in air that had been modified and waterproofed and filled with oil in order to work underwater. And so one of the really, I think, important questions that I wanted to ask as a student was, well, are there other impacts of being underwater? And what I came upon was really you're in this denser and more viscous fluid, and you also have slippery films. And these things are going to be very unique physically as compared to being in air. So how should we design our system differently? So in terms of grasping, you might think of, well, are there any underwater graspers? I would say that the jaws and the mouth of the fish is an incredible grasper. Here you can see a larger fish pulling in its prey simply by opening its jaws and rapidly sucking in water. And this is really a principle or a property that developed underwater uniquely. I think there's a couple animals that evolved something like this on land, but it's something like an elephant that has huge, huge lungs and might be able to suck in a potato chip, right? But you don't go up to your pasta and just like suck and hope it goes into your mouth, right? You use a fork, you use physical contact. So suction flow feeding is ubiquitous underwater, and it makes so much sense. So why don't we add this to a robot hand? And so we went ahead and did this. You can see loops of tubing off to the left, and it's not integrated very elegantly, but this was an early concept. And you can see the scale of forces is on the order of a little more than 1 Newton for the pumps that we selected, and these are small pumps. And then the distance with which you start to feel those forces is on the order of a couple millimeters. So this is really, really small. And here's the effect similar to that fish sucking in its prey. This is actually the first take. I just tossed in a little Lego block and it went straight to the fingertips. And this is a much easier task to perform than trying to sort of fish around with your fingers and grab it. So the question is, well, what about more, big or massive objects? What are the limits to this, and how much suction flow do you need? And so this comes down to these concepts of water drag and inertia. So here's a larger object. It's an order of magnitude more massive. And you can see that without suction, we have no hope of grasping it, but with suction, we do. And so we want to understand how variable this is and how much impact it has. So here's the overall setup of the robot hand on the bottom facing upward, and the yellow star is that video that I just showed you. And so this is showing the region in which we can successfully grasp an object. And the purpose of doing this kind of grasp region analysis is to say, if I'm floating around, how off can I be? How accurate does my arm need to be to secure a grasp? The dots are the experiments and the lines are simulations. And you can see that when we go from no suction to with suction, we get about a 30%, 30-some% increase in our grasp region. And it's most helpful when an object is right near the boundary of whether we can grasp it or not. Now, this is a really useful tool to be able to do these simulations in a rapid dynamic simulation. So we use the package SimGrasp. And using a simplified model for suction force. And the great thing about sort of validating the utility of this is now we can vary the task, right? So it was quite labor intensive to collect that initial set of data. And so now we can take the original object that we had and maybe make the mass of the object an order of magnitude bigger in red. And that 1 Newton of force is still making a difference. That's pretty incredible. But then of course, if your object gets too big or too massive, like 10 kilograms, there's no real purpose to having suction. So this becomes a design tool. We can also look at across object mass, how much suction do we need? What pumps do we need? And kind of getting the most utility for changing or improving our suction in this middle mass region. Okay, so that concludes sort of that idea of adding suction to manipulate our contact conditions for this dynamic grasping of a floating object. But the object that we acquired from the shipwreck was extremely slippery. It's what I felt like was almost like a wet bar of soap. It was covered in this thick biofilm. And so we want to be able to test this on slippery objects as well. And so here's a bar of soap. And with suction, we can grab it. And you might say, okay, well, that's kind of obvious. You're increasing your normal force by sucking or pulling on this surface. But in fact, we're not getting a seal. And so we found that we're getting also an increase in our coefficient of friction, especially on rough surfaces. So you're essentially pulling the water through that interface. And that actually gives you a nice suction feel on rough, sandpaper surfaces as well. And then we can reduce our friction by pumping water in the opposite direction as well. And so this gives us a range of very interesting sort of push and pull right at the fingertip in a very interesting way underwater. Okay, now this next slide is going to be a total aside, but I do know that there's folks at Toronto interested in underwater systems. And so this work is under review and in preparation, but I just wanted to mention that we are now currently interested in how smaller scale systems can do manipulation. So thinking about that fish again, you know, what kind of jaw allows you to grip onto surfaces? And we're doing these studies in fish as well as in robotic systems. You know, how do you grip onto and then manipulate materials like tearing something off of a substrate with a robotic fish? Okay. All right, so that pretty much covers the sort of the compliant and contact condition elements that we've been interested in these underwater environments. And so now I want to move on to some of the other elements of this second region, which is on the lubricated skin. So I think very reasonably, some folks have said, okay, suction seems very helpful in a specific scenario, right? Where maybe you have the ability to carry around pumps and add in this tubing, but it may not be super practical in other environments. And one really important one is when you're not totally submerged. When you're kind of going in and out from a wet scenario, the pumping becomes much more complicated as you start pulling in both water and air. And so if we can move away from an active system to a more passive system, I think this could be broadly adoptable. So here what we're doing is actually backing up and saying, what's the simplest technology we could think of? Well, it's a rubber skin. The vast majority of robot hands have some sort of rubbery frictional skin surface, but what is the geometry of that skin? And when humans are interacting with objects underwater for a long time, our fingers get wrinkly. Now, I would say this is still out for debate. Some people have found evidence that the wrinkles have some mechanical advantage to, you know, some sort of frictional element, but others have found the opposite, that actually the wrinkles can reduce friction. So from the biological perspective, I would say not yet concluded. But what we can do is answer this from the robot side by parametrically studying different skin geometries. So that's what we did. And so you can see here that we tested a number of features. So we're keeping the nominal contact area the same, but we're moving from one feature to 3 features to many, many features and testing each one individually. Here, we're actually increasing the lubrication by testing an oil and then vertically pulling upward and measuring the friction coefficient. Here you can see the dynamic friction coefficient and the initial peak. We didn't report initial peak for one because it's so slippery that we don't even measure one. And you can see that we get this optimal friction property at 3 contacts. Okay, what's going on there? So to really understand how this lubricating film is affecting contact, we came up with a new way to visualize it, which is essentially just FTIR in an acrylic or glass plate, and then using a dyed oil on top of it, which allows you to visualize not only the contact region, but also the thickness of the film. And so this is how it operates. And the important part about using this oil rather than water, which wouldn't work, is that they have a very similar index of refraction to the material on which it's sitting. And so you can see here that as we visualize dry contact with 1 versus 3, they're very, very similar. And in fact, 1 is going to be stickier. It's going to be better. It's going to be a little bit more catastrophic when it starts to slip. But 1 is typically better. But then when we go into this wet circumstance, 1 is basically slipping off on its own, but then 3 is giving us that nice sort of stick slip behavior that we would expect in dry. Okay, so that's as far as we took it. I think when we're thinking of underwater environments, especially in the field, there's maybe a combination of spines. Spines are a very common area of research, and we've also been kind of interested in this for very rocky surfaces. But I think this is a growing and interesting area of research for us. I will say this is work that we did before the pandemic and kind of got put on hold during the pandemic, but I'm hoping that we can continue it as we move forward. Okay. So we've gone pretty deep into compliance and contact conditions for underwater multi-finger hands. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is to bring in the sense of touch, and then we're going to go out of the water. Okay, so sense of touch. So when we think of some of the systems that I've just shown you, suction flow is one of them. And what are we doing with suction flow? We have a pump, we're pulling water through it, and then as it gets clogged and unclogged, that flow rate is going to change. And you can actually measure flow rate with a differential pressure transducer that's going to be insensitive to ambient pressure, which is going to change with depth. So that leads us to, well, let's monitor this and see how our contact is changing. So what I'm going to show you here is a video on the left-hand side of this fingertip interacting with this flat, smooth surface. Here you can see a measure of flow. This is our differential pressure transducer. And we're going to look at that as our angle with the surface, theta is changing. So here we're going to come into the surface, make nice contact with it. And then as we stick and slip up the surface, we see these peaks. We saturate the signal at some angle, and then it's going to come down and pop off the surface. And you can see that the pressure transducer actually amplified that dynamic event with this spike. Okay, so now I wanted to show this. So Philip Nadeau, who is a PhD student at Toronto, led this in a summer project, looking at how we can now use this signal in a more realistic grasping task. And so here we're trying to do the manipulation of pipes underwater, which could be an interesting industrial task. And you can see on the left-hand side, this is just a palpation. So we're trying to figure out if we can detect the stiffness of an object through haptic exploration. And the right-hand side is the pipe experiment, where we're actually using the sensor signal first in feedback control to pose the finger relative to the object, so control the grasp, and then monitor the forces and the interaction between the hand and the pipe as it gets pulled out of the hand. Okay. So I'm coming to the end of this section now, but why is it that we might want to add suction tactile sensing? I think there's a couple advantages for when we design basically a system that is interacting physically with the environment, but is being actuated from a distance. And this is going to be a theme that kind of emerges, I think, out of the fact that we're building systems for field operation. So here you can see that the pump could be located anywhere on the robot, and the piping is going down along the arm. If you do this, then the flow sensors could be located far away from the hand. Now, hands, they're exposed to the world, they are extended from the body, and their job is inherently to impact the world, right? And so sensitive electronics often get challenged in a way that for field operation, they often get omitted altogether, right? And so you're kind of just relying on the passive system. And so I think one sort of middle ground is to think about how we can design a hand that's completely passive that can be sensed from far away. Okay. So we've finished up with our work underwater. So now we want to move back to this overall vision where we maybe have a more complex system or a more complex environment that also includes air. And so as the next step away from sort of what I've been telling you so far is to really question, well, are these ideas around suction flow, do they have any utility in air? I already motivated the use of suction flow underwater by saying that fish do it, but is there some scale at which it does make sense in air as well? Okay. So the technology that already uses suction in air is the classic suction cup. And this is a technology that is really, universal, especially in industrial settings, to do pick and place. But typically, people assume that this is a binary system where it's either sucked onto a surface and it's successful, or it has a break and seal and it's just air is flowing like crazy. And so people have monitored flow rate before in these systems, but it is treated as that binary type of signal. And so what we want to do is to try and create an analog signal out of this physical interaction that's going to be more useful, very similar to the underwater work. So what we're going to do is create these internal chambers. So there's actually 4 little chambers inside, and each one has a penetration. Now, no flow is actually going through this signal, but what it's doing is allowing a remote pressure sensor to monitor the wall pressure of each chamber, which gives us an understanding of flow rate. Okay, so we're actually estimating the differential flow rate between these 4 chambers, and flow is actually pulled up and then out this single vacuum line. Now, what we're going to do is try to figure out, well, what if we have very, very small breaks in seal? Can we actually get a useful signal? So the first thing that we want to do is to monitor how fast and how these signals change as a suction cup gets pulled off. Okay, so we want to be able to monitor the grip. So we're going to use FTIR again as a visualization tool, and you can see on the right-hand side how the lip of the seal actually breaks at the bottom. And what's going to happen is flow is going to shoot upward, and maximum of flow is actually going to occur in the opposite chamber. And we can visualize this as well as compare it to our flow measures. And so you can see a CFD simulation of that case where you have a break and seal over here, and maximum flow is going to occur in the opposite chamber. So this isn't necessarily a simple physical system, but it is, I think, an informative one. And you can see that borne out here in these plots as well, where chamber 4 shows the biggest drop in pressure. Okay, and so the other idea that we could do is to consider how we might be able to explore a surface, especially a textured surface, to find the smoothest location that's going to be best for suction gripping. Because you could, visualize a surface, but not be able to detect these things very easily, especially on this surface, which is both clear and textured. So here you can see the suction cup. We're actually reducing the pressure with which we're pulling on the suction. So that allows us to do this gentle sliding rather than just getting stuck. And you can see that if we just look at all of them together, there's a ramp up of suction engagement for the middle section, for the bumpy section, but it doesn't totally increase until we get onto the smooth section. And so here's a close-up of that where we have no seal, the rough seal, and then the smooth seal, giving us that sort of very interesting resolution of the surface. And as we go forward with this project, we're exploring different sort of interaction or haptic exploration procedures to get different types of information. So this object, this PCB, which is bumpy and has holes and vias, would probably not be an object that would be commonly gripped by a suction cup unless you had a really good model of the object. But let's say this is recycling, so you don't have a good model for the object. You could actually explore the surface, come up with a very simple sort of heuristic search algorithm to find the best point to grasp. So here is just doing a blind search. And then when it gets close to a graspable location here, it uses the signal to define its next grasp location. And so that's how we're doing it in this particular circumstance. We're actually looking for the secondary flow channel, and it works fairly consistently on this object. Okay, so a whirlwind overview of all projects. I actually want to shift gears again to another flow-based sensor. Now, this one is going to be a pretty big sort of shift in that we're no longer using the flow that we're generating at the contact interface for our information. We are still adding flow to the system and getting a tactile signal, but it's now not at the interaction contact point itself. Okay, so we've explored the idea of pumping air in and actually using the whistles. So here you can see this is what's called a fipple, and it's kind of what you would get on a slide whistle. And it's going to look something like this, and air is going to come out here and resonate across this sharp edge. And then after it, we're going to have a resonant tube here. So we've got this nice long resonant tube, and together they're going to make an audible sound. Okay, and here you can see a model for how we expect the frequency of the system to change with the length. Okay, so as it gets longer, the frequency is going to go down. All right. And so this is essentially a displacement sensor that we can couple to a compliant system and understand the forces that are being interacted with it. Okay. So in this particular hand prototype, we've got 3 different frequencies because we're starting with 3 different base tube lengths, different sort of modalities. So one is a resonant tube here. The other one is a resonant tube on the other side of this one, but this one actually has a hole poked in it, kind of like a whistle or a recorder. And then up here we have just a linear probe. And the way that this works, so here we have a tube and we're just going to stretch it and unstretch it. And you can see that the frequency changes. And this is fairly linear across the tube length tested. We can also assume that the tube is going to deform as the finger curls. And so we can get an idea of the curvature of the soft finger just by listening to it. And then that recorder idea, if you punch a hole, you can get a proximity sensor as well, where as we get closer and closer, it's actually going to change its frequency. Okay, so now I'm going to play you the sound. I will just apologize now because it's very loud and I don't know how it's translating on your end. Let's go ahead and listen. Oh, the video, here we are. So hopefully you can hear it. You can hear that frequency kind of going up and down as we go. So what does that signal actually look like? So here's what the frequency plot looks like on the top. And then here is our sort of processing of it. And you can start to see that various signals of this interaction with the object are actually being borne out in the signals that we're measuring. Now on the next slide, you're also going to hear another loud sound potentially. And this is to show basically, it's almost like a comical look at how loud you can make these things. So here, we're just recording this with a phone. You see we walk all the way down the hall, we walk all the way down the next hall, and you can keep detecting that signal fairly well until you get far away. Okay, so I think that's kind of a fun exploration. I think the next logical steps are to try to make it not quite so loud for humans, or maybe it's only something that is currently suitable in remote environments with an atmosphere. But yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there, and hopefully some new work on that comes out soon. Okay, so we have gone into a lot of flow-based technologies. And so I wanted to now kind of shift paces and look at one of our newer thrusts in the lab, which is trying to understand physical interaction with the ground, with granular media. Now, this is kind of interesting because there are times when it can flow, kind of like a fluid, but it also has more complex physics in that it can also not, right? It can jam and it can do very interesting things, even more so than you might get with a liquid. Okay. So here we are, we went across and did our unconventional tactile sensors. And so now we're going to get into natural terrain and granular media. Okay, so the themes that we had previously were really around how do we forcefully manipulate objects, right? And when I'm thinking about ground applications, one thing that I would love to do is to be able to rethink this idea of construction with very large machines. And this really makes the most sense. Well, I'll get there. You know, when I think about this large excavator, whatever is at its tractive, whatever is at its treads is going to be crushed, right? So it might make some difference, but whether it's, you know, leaves or sand might not make quite as much difference for as compared to a very small machine. And this is going to be an important consideration for space applications where it costs a lot to send massive objects, and you also have a reduction in gravity. And so this is going to get us into the work that we've been doing for the NASA Early Career Grant. And so what we envision for very forceful construction like tasks on something like Mars or the moon is actually to use a team of much smaller robots that can work together to still do that very forceful task. And there's going to be a couple elements to this. One is, how do we actually just attach this machine to the environment? How do we increase that traction, that holding force? How do we predict what forces we can get from the system to inform control, and then how do we put this all together in a multi-robot system. I do want to point out that we are not focusing on rocky interaction here because NASA has already done an incredible field of work on spine engagement and spined robots, and they're awesome. And so what we want to do is supplement that technology when you don't have strong rocks around or when you have to use granular interaction. So one animal that we were kind of interested in to start thinking about when we create anchor designs, and this is because it's very hard to sort of penetrate devices and objects down into the ground. Why not actually take the robot and have the robot be the anchor itself? So actually burrow the robot down and have that resist forces. So this is the Pacific mole crab, and it's one of the better burrowers in terms of a legged device. So thinking of something that might be able to locomote, but then also burrow down. And we have the awesome luck of being at Berkeley, which has Bob Full in integrative biology, who's just an incredible researcher, and he was looking at Pacific mole crabs at the time. Okay, so one thing I want to point out for these animals is on the left-hand side, we've got these legs going in one direction, and then we've got the blue legs going in an opposite direction. And we sort of pose this idea or hypothesis that these two opposite directions are going to be really important for locomoting downward. And so this brings us to the robot Ember, which is the Emerita burrowing robot. It's about 4 times the size scale of the real mole crab. And so we're also using larger grains. These are plastic beads, but they are actually quite difficult to move through. And in fact, downward burrowing, especially with legs, is a known and very challenging task. In fact, this is going to be the very first robot able to do so with legs in the most traditional sense. So a lot of works burrow sideways or use specialized drilling mechanisms to burrow down. Okay, so this is how it works. We've got some sweeping legs with this crank mechanism. We've got these nice sort of rubber cuticles to keep the grains from getting into our robot. And here you see one of the burrowing events where it's able to actually move its body downward in this sort of cyclical fashion and almost completely submerge its entire body. Okay. Now, how do we start to draw sort of useful design tools? Sorry, the videos are a little glitchy. How do we start to create tools so that we can understand how this is actually working to design other systems? And here what we're going to do is use what's called granular resistive force theory. So what we're going to do is actually integrate up all the forces that we would expect to experience on all the different elements of the leg, and then add them up together. Now I'm going to get into granular resistive force theory a little bit later. So right now it's a little vague. But the main outcome from this is that we can do these very fast, large parametric studies. Now on these plots here, you're going to see there's a star, and that is the real design that we were able to get to burrow. On the top, there is a design exploration where what we're doing is changing the angle at which it is trying to burrow down, as well as the orientation of the legs. So by changing gamma, we're actually shifting where this blue leg up here is. And we find that it actually is better to shift it upward into this region here, which kind of looks more like the real mole crab, which is kind of interesting. And then there's this control study, which is around the relative phasing of the front and back leg. Do they go together, or does one lead the other? And we find that there is actually this region in here, which is going to be preferred. So it's kind of cool that these very simplified granular interaction models are bearing out sort of the trends that we see experimentally. Okay, so that is, how do we get our robot to burrow down? Now the question is, once it's burrowed down, how much force of tugging can we get from this anchor point? So this is going to bring us to, now we are actually switching platforms for now. I am hoping to close the loop with the other platform as well. But here we've got a 4-legged kind of R-hex, mini R-hex like robot, and it's going to be pulling on this sled. Now it has a little winch right here on its back end, and that's what it's going to use. And really the work here is posing the hypothesis that we can generate limit surfaces using granular resistive force theory in a way that's useful for estimating and controlling robot behavior and informing controls. Now, limit surface analysis has been applied to robot hands and manipulation for a very long time. It's just a very useful way to do fast simulations. But this is the first time it's getting applied to granular interactions in this way. Okay, so on the right-hand side, you're going to see a set of experiments where we're just pulling on this robot to see what are the forces and what are the wrenches that we're able to get from a legged robot underground. And the line is the model, and the squiggly line is the force measurements. And so you can see that this modeling method seems to be pretty useful in this case. We also have different burrowing strategies. So DH is deep high load. We've got a less deep burrowing strategy, which is deep low load, and then shallow high load. And so the energy of burrowing in these different strategies is quite different, right? So if you want to reduce energy consumption, shallow is better than deep. And then we've got the forces that each one can actually withstand. So if you want high loads, then going deeper is better. Okay, so there is this very natural trade-off as you are deciding how to deploy your robot. And so here you can see for a 400 gram or very relatively lightweight load, all of the strategies work fine. So each robot is taking a slightly different strategy as it burrows into the media. But you can see that the cumulative energy of the robot is going to be better for the shallow strategy. Okay. Now, what if we make the sled a little heavier? So here you can see, again, the same three strategies. With the shallow case, you're going to see that it's going to actually fail on its second attempt. So here it's going to not be able to withstand the tugging forces. And then the deep low load is going to fail on this next attempt. Flip over. And then the deep high load is the only one that can complete all three tuggings. Okay. All right, so this is ongoing work. This is actually currently under review now, but hopefully the full analysis will come out soon for folks to review. Okay, so the sort of big takeaway from this section, I think, is the utility or the power of creating new modeling methods for understanding the interaction forces with granular media. Granular media is all around us. Now, granular resistive force theory is not new at all. It's not, our lab did not come up with this. But what it is a first order approximation of intrusion forces given a defined motion. Now, it relies first on experimentally characterizing your media through penetration studies, which are time consuming. And then also it is computed based on velocity direction. So it does not work when velocity goes to zero. And both of these things, I think, are real limiting factors for laboratories to actually adopt this, I think, very useful tool. So the first thing that we did, oh, and also I think because of this experimental characterization limitation, most people deploy it in 2 dimensions. So the first thing we did was came up with a new way to implement 3D granular resistive force theory using simplified approximations from basically a limited set of empirical characterizations. So that was work that came out in 2021, was actually the first 3D implementation in that way. And then I think this is really backing up to show that, really the standard today for granular interaction is discrete element method, which can take days or even in some cases weeks to run a single simulation. So it's great for understanding the real physics, but not for large parametric studies. And there's a variety of other options in the middle. The reason why we're interested in RFT is because it is so fast. It's just a closed form calculation. And then the method that we're using for the limit surfaces is to essentially take RFT, 3D RFT, apply various wrenches, create this wrench space with associated twists, and then we can fit some sort of surface to these experimental points. And then the big question is how representative, or how do we represent the estimated motion given a particular wrench that we may not have actually measured. Okay, so that is, how do we model now the forces that we might expect to get out of the system? And so backing up now to look at this entire system, we've talked about this contact point. But one really important contact point that I have not brought up, and I would say generally causes people trouble, is the contact between the tether and the environment. This is really, really important. And what I'm showing here is just the simplified capstan equation. So as you wrap a string around an object, you get this sort of integration of friction that allows you to exponentially apply more forces to the environment. You can actually see this with like when you're flossing, right? If you just try to squeeze your floss, it's going to slip out of your fingers. But if you wrap it around your finger a couple of times, it's going to be like you're going to crush your finger before that floss comes off, right? So go ahead and try that tonight while you're flossing. What we can do though is I think oftentimes when it comes to planning and controls, these contacts are avoided. They're seen as adversarial because it becomes kind of difficult to model these systems. We're trying to flip it around and say, but yeah, you can also get this exponential increase in your force. So if I increase my holding force on this side from 5 newtons to 10 newtons, I'm doubling it. And when I put it into this exponential equation, I get huge increases in my ability to resist forces from the central payload. So you can see this in a very simple case here where the robot on the left-hand side, is not able to resist the forces. In the middle, it is able to resist those. Oh, what is going on? In the middle, we're now going to wrap our string around these rocks. And then on the right-hand side, once the string is deployed, we're able to resist those tugging forces. Okay, so here we have, I think there's a number of different configurations or applications that one could think of for this. I'm going to go ahead and show a little bit from this combination where we're, going in a living environment. So around Berkeley, there's a lot of redwood trees. And we're going to use a single capstan with a small robot that here is going to go ahead and jump off the top of our little rover that's stuck. And then what we're going to do is have it run out into the environment. And here we're just actually remote controlling this. So we are not dealing with the planning issue at all. The only exception is that we've calculated how much wrap angle we need, and it's about 360 degrees. And so we're going to go just about 360 degrees. So we're right at the edge of what we need. Okay, so now we're going to use the winch on the rover and actually winch this rover forward. And you can see that the mini legged robot actually flips over, but despite that, the maneuver is overall successful, and the rover is able to drive forward on its own. Okay. So if that little rover had just run out, there would have been no chance. It really is that exponential amplification of the capstan that allows this maneuver in any way. Okay, so to start thinking about how we might move forward with some, framework for controls or planning, we went around and we actually measured, well, how well does the capstan equation actually match the trends that we see? So here we wrapped a string around this redwood tree, and we've done this for 10 trees to see how well this exponential actually fits. And we find it to be fairly consistently helpful, and sort of these ranges and minimum and maximum expected events. Now, there's always going to be upper outliers because of snagging or tugging between, let's say, the bark and the string, but the lower bound is fairly consistent. And so, yeah, if you're interested in this, it is out now actually through Robotics and Automation Letters, so go ahead and check it out. Now, throughout this whole thing, you might be thinking, okay, capstans, this is not a new technology. And I completely agree. I think there's potential evidence that it might have been used by the ancient Egyptians. But there are some really big, I think, important reasons why it is not commonly used in robotics. And it's fear of tangling and difficulty in understanding that physical interaction. So I think this is an important area for ongoing work. And what we're finding is that in a robotic system, you generally don't want to loop multiple times around one object if you want it to be reversible. So I see us moving towards the utilization of many capstan objects in a sort of interesting mapping. Okay, and as we move forward, we're going to be thinking about how this can be applied in multiple robot systems, which you can see on the bottom, allowing for two-dimensional motion. Okay, so I think that's all the projects that I have for you today. And really what I want, if anything, I know it's a whirlwind, but if anything, what I want you to take away from this talk is that, the technologies that you saw here, none of them were particularly expensive or complicated, or, they're fairly easy to make. In some cases, literally just a string. But you can change how you're physically interacting with the world through changing your friction, essentially, changing your contact conditions. So hopefully I have convinced you that, not everything needs to be solved in planning or controls. I think there's really an important role for systems design in these kinds of problems. And so today I showed a good subset of our line of work. I do want to just point out for anybody interested that we do have a newer line of work in human assistance and human grasping. Most of these are conference papers and maybe a journal or two under review now. And this is kind of ramped up during the pandemic. And so it's a little delayed, but we're doing some really cool stuff that really is, how do we harness the abilities or the physical abilities of the person and then augment them with interesting design properties. And so just a broad brushstroke is we're really thinking about, how do we understand the body power of the person that we're working with in order to come up with creative new systems that augment that person without getting in their way. So keep your eyes out. And but with that, I will go ahead and stop for any questions.
All right, that was perfect. That was an exceptional talk. I myself felt inspired, and I actually, a talk is good when there are private messages being sent around saying this talk is amazing. So maybe I can open the floor for questions from Zoom or from YouTube. Who wants to go first? Anyone?
I'll go first. Hannah, really, really awesome, really interesting and inspiring work. I love the way that you talked about so many projects, but tied them together in such a meaningful way. This whistle sensor is so fun and creative. I was wondering if it's possible. I know that the frequency is probably set by the length of the cavity, but is it possible to design it with ultrasonic frequency so it's not audible?
Yeah, so we've been trying. That would be awesome. I think everybody in lab would appreciate that because basically they need to test at night because it's making sounds. There's a couple things. So we've started to explore. I think it gets smaller and smaller, which is also nice as a tactile sensor because it could then maybe have more spatial resolution, or we're kind of moving away from like one long whistle in a structure to like an array of smaller ones. Right, we got close, but there was always one or two people in lab, maybe with healthy young ears, who could hear it. So yeah, we'll see, but it's definitely a goal. The nature of the device will change. It won't be like a little fipple anymore. Yeah.
Depends on the age of people, I think.
I think it does. Yeah. I can't hear it, so.
Jessica, do you want to go next?
Thank you, Hannah. This talk was phenomenal. I had a blast. It was a lot of fun to follow your whirlwind. I'm super excited about the tether friction. It doesn't really apply to what we're doing, but I guess a line of my research also tries to use contact to increase abilities of continuum robots and soft robots. So that spoke to me. And I love the idea about using anchors with the environment. That was very inspiring to me. I was just wondering, how would one plan for where would be anchors and how would that tie to like an overall, I guess, system level? Did you put any thought on this, or do you have any collaborators that look into this?
Yeah, so we're working with JP at JPL. And yeah, so I have a student now who's very interested in those questions. And I think we're going to simplify the problem to just like a 2D flat plane of granular media for now. it's very interesting because you can actually increase your holding force by allowing your anchor to fail. So you get mounding, or you can kind of design your anchor to like burrow through getting tugged, which is super cool. So then it's just a question of how do we characterize that in a way that's useful for the planning. Sorry, I actually just went on a tangent on the granular media. The tether contact, no, I would say we're kind of taking a step back for now. We're focused more on that granular interaction. I think it would come down to having a collaborator who's I think prepared to answer some of the more difficult planning problems. Yeah.
Cool. We should follow up on this. I'm excited. But that's for now. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
Great. Igor, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I can only repeat what everyone has said. It's been a really fantastic talk. And I'm curious, so I working on more on algorithmic side of the robotics. I'm curious, what would you say are the common learnings when you think about controlling these very different types of actuators? Are there any common learnings? I know there's this big hype about foundation models and how to adapt them to robotics. Is there something that you think one can learn from actuating one type for actuating a very different other type of actuator?
I fear that you're asking a very good question and I'm just not following it completely, because maybe just my area of expertise is not necessarily in that. Maybe can you rephrase it just maybe a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So when you control for the control of your robot, what approaches do you use? Is there any like commonality between them, or is this always like tailored to also this very much the setting and the hardware setup in your case?
Yeah, so maybe I can give it an example. So for the suction cup, what we're doing now is using DexNet just as is, like one of the recent versions, just to plan out positions. But that's kind of like a baseline. It's just like, okay, that's like a methods, right? It's not necessarily the innovation. But then when we say is when you fail to grasp, let's create a haptic procedure based on the types of sensor signals that we have. And we'll try a couple different ones. So it might be random searching, it might be based on the pressure sensors that we have. But they're relatively, I would say that they're relatively just like hand-tuned. They're kind of more heuristic. I think that very much limits sort of the power of demonstrating that technology. So I'm always kind of looking for folks who want to get a suction cup from us and apply more sophisticated methods. Hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, exactly.
Any other questions? I have a couple of my own. So how do you think about tactile feedback in terms of granular materials? I don't work in tactile sensing, but it seems like there's a hard divide between suction and more rigid type of contact. And I feel like in the case of granular materials, for example, if you use suction, you're going to lose your materials. So what are the options there for having a more unified interface, perhaps?
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's like not yet submitted, but we are working with a capacitive array of slip sensors, which I know is work that I think Diller, you've been working on. Sorry, I'm forgetting the authorship, but yeah, so we're really interested in that idea of like slip on surfaces and monitoring that. I think so. The robot, the burrowing robot, Ember, it is an unstable burrow, right? So if you get tipped too high, you fail. If you tip too low, you fail. And so it is like, I think it is something you need feedback control on if you're going to consistently dig deep. We showed it's possible, but there were a lot of failures as well. And it's because we just did an open loop control strategy. So yeah, so monitoring, but I think it's not enough to monitor just the pose of your body. I think you need to be monitoring how your fins are actually interacting with the media. So I see that as like a very next logical step. I do know Veronica Santos was doing some cool stuff with like haptic exploration of objects underground. Yeah, I think it's definitely an area that needs exploration, and its suction I don't think makes sense. But a lot of animals fluidize. A lot of animals blow air or water
Mhm.
out in order to make it easier to burrow. And there could be some variation in the pressure needed to do so.
Mhm.
I have not thought of that before, but I think maybe that's worth looking at.
Thank you. Hannah, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I'll ask a quick question. Thank you for the amazing talk. I'm particularly interested in the whistle shape sensing you have. I just took a quick glance over the paper, so maybe my question is answered in the paper. But what do you think are the capabilities for the shape sensing of your whistle design? Do you think you could detect, you know, different curvatures, maybe multiple separate curvatures?
Mhm.
I'm asking in the context of maybe continuum robots applications in this space.
Yeah, so we have an early prototype. I'd say I've been surprised with how unintuitive it is to try and design with these vibrational soft structures, right? So I think it makes sense to maybe collaborate with somebody who does modeling of structures with vibrations and sound production, or to make that a part of it. And so it's been a more challenging task than I thought to just oh, you can't just add another tube. Now those two tubes are interacting with each other. And so, but yes, I think if you were able to design it right and create the cavities in a way that interacted positively in an effective manner, it would make sense to have multiple chambers, maybe different sizes, dimensions, lengths, and then you could get much more interesting understanding of the overall motion of a structure. So that's, again, the next logical step, I think, or one of the next logical steps for that line of work. Mm-hmm.
Cool, thanks for the.
All right, amazing. So maybe we should land the plane here and allow Hannah to go to her one-on-one meetings with faculty and students. But thanks everyone for joining. This was an amazing talk. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you, everyone.
So I guess we're chatting.